What's going on, guys? It's me, Zach, bringing you guys another video. And this one I'm going to go over the best rookie landing spots, or in general, just the rookie landing spots of players at each position. I'm going to make this a 4 video series. I'll do the quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, and then tight ends. So this video is going to be me going over each of the landing spots for the quarterbacks of note from this most recent NFL draft. It was a really exciting draft. A lot of shakeups happened, and I think it's going to be really important to stay on top of those and sort of make sure you're well aware of what happened in the draft and sort of see how that's going to influence things going forward. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I think we're just going to see more and more activity come up with the NFL. We're going to see a lot more team practicing and everything coming up in this near future, and we're really going to start getting that news cycle going. So yeah, really excited to keep making these videos for you guys. And yeah, with that, let's get into the first set of quarterbacks. So in this most recent draft, I think there were about 6 quarterbacks drafted that I think have a chance at being fantasy relevant going forward. The most obvious names here are those taken in the first round. You've got Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young, and C.J. Stroud. And then there's a couple other guys that I think are worth talking about. Most notably, I think Hendon Hooker and Will Levis have a good shot at being somewhat relevant. And then last, I feel like I should mention Stetson Bennett just because of how prolific he was in college. But like I'll touch on later, I don't think he's really going to have much of a future in the NFL, but I felt like he'd at least deserve to be mentioned here. So starting this off with what I think is going to be the most exciting landing spot for a quarterback, at least in terms of fantasy, is going to be Anthony Richardson. He went at pick number 4 to the Indianapolis Colts, and I think this is just going to be a really great landing spot for him. He gets Shane Steichen as his head coach, who was really crucial in the development of Jalen Hurts, and he was also very developmental in Justin Herbert's rookie season. So I think there's a lot to like there from a coaching standpoint. They've got Jonathan Taylor to help complement that running game. And honestly, this offensive line is pretty great as well. They had a bit of a down year last year, but I think it's reasonable to assume they'll get better going forward. And their wide receiver core is decent. Obviously, Michael Pittman is a true number 1 wide receiver, but they don't really have much behind him. I do worry that they're going to be very limited weapons on this offense from a pass catching standpoint. And I think that could really limit Anthony Richardson's ceiling because I don't think he's going to have a whole lot of passing volume. But Anthony Richardson's obviously a freak athlete. He's going to have a ton of rushing production. And I think that's going to make him the most fantasy relevant one of these quarterbacks, and honestly, probably the only one of them that has any real path to fantasy relevance as a rookie. We normally see that these rookie quarterbacks come in, and even those that perform admirably don't really do a whole lot in terms of fantasy just because you don't see those guys put up 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. So any guy that can really put up fantasy production is going to have to really generate quite a lot of production on the ground, and Richardson does give you that upside. I will say that there's a chance that Anthony Richardson isn't their week 1 starter. Jim Irsay, their owner, indicated that he will be, but it's tough to tell. They did bring in Gardner Minshew as well to be a backup. He came over with Shane Steichen from Philadelphia, so I think they'll be pretty comfortable with him. And I mean, everyone knows that Anthony Richardson's a pretty raw prospect. So I think it's possible that they sort of ease him into things, and we see really Minshew start the season, and then see Anthony Richardson take over after that. But in general, I think that Richardson's going to be the only quarterback really worth spending too much time looking at from a redraft standpoint, and from dynasty standpoint, he would be my quarterback 1 in this rookie class. He's just got the most rushing upside. I think from a purely NFL standpoint, he's probably going to have the 3rd best career behind guys like C.J. Stroud and Bryce Young, but he's really talented and he's super athletic, so the upside really is just immeasurable. Next up here, we've got Bryce Young. He was the number 1 overall pick drafted to the Carolina Panthers this offseason, and I think he's actually finding himself in a pretty good landing spot as well. He's got Frank Reich as his head coach, who's a guy that I personally think is actually, honestly, a really good NFL coach. I'm surprised to see the Colts let him go. I think they just sort of wanted to change the scenery there. But anyhow, the Carolina Panthers do have a really great offensive line. We saw them really just dominate on the ground last season, and that's something that I think is really going to be beneficial for a young quarterback. It's something that Bryce Young sort of seems like he needs, given that he doesn't really have that mobility that some of these other guys do. They do have a pretty messy wide receiver core. It's headlined by Adam Thielen, Jonathan Mingo, DJ Chark, Terrace Marshall, and Laviska Shenault. There's maybe a chance that Mingo steps up and finds himself as a true number 1 here, but otherwise there's just a lot of B and C tier options on this offense, and they got Hayden Hurst at tight end as well. Nobody that really stands out as somebody that's going to really scare a defense, so I think you're going to see it really be difficult for him to really move the ball at times. They do have a good running game that's going to be very helpful for him, and they've got a good defense as well, which I think is going to help keep them in some decent games. There's honestly a good chance that this Carolina Panthers team wins the NFC South, but from a fantasy standpoint, he's not going to offer a whole lot of production for you on the ground, and there aren't very sexy weapons for him to throw the ball to, and it's going to be a team that's probably going to try and win games with defense and the running game. So really, I think that Bryce Young's going to be a guy that maybe from a dynasty standpoint has upside, just because maybe he finds himself being like a Kirk Cousins type guy, a Drew Brees, where he's putting up 4,000 plus yards every year and 30 touchdowns, but I don't really see that happening this year because most rookies can't do that, especially with this wide receiver core. And he's not going to offer you the rushing upside that you'll need. So as a rookie, you can pretty much ignore him, and then maybe he evolves into a Kirk Cousins type player. But I think that's kind of his ceiling going forward. So honestly, I have him ranked as my third quarterback from a rookie standpoint in Dynasty. Next up, we've got CJ Stroud, who was drafted number 2 overall to the Houston Texans. I personally think CJ Stroud was the most talented quarterback in this NFL draft. If I had the number 1 pick as a general manager in the NFL, I would have taken CJ Stroud. And there's just a lot to love with CJ Stroud, the prospect. He's got really talented arm, he makes good decisions with the ball, and he's got more mobility than I think he gives himself credit for. He didn't really run the ball a whole lot in college, but I think that there's plenty of mobility there and reason to assume that that might tick up once he gets to the pro level. There are a lot of things to dislike about his situation. The Houston Texans do have a pretty good running game with Dameon Pierce and Devin Singletary there. Their offensive line, however, is not great. They don't really have many weapons. They've got Nico Collins, Robert Woods, John Mechie, Tank Dell. Not a whole lot to really love there. Maybe John Mechie could step up and be a true number 1. I'm certainly rooting for him, but they don't have really a lot there. They've got Dalton Schultz at tight end, who's really not special as well. So I think that in general we're going to see just him be very limited by the weapons that he's throwing to. There's not going to be a whole lot of guys that are really going to help prop him up to a 4,000 yard to 30 touchdown season. So if we want to see immediate fantasy value out of CJ Stroud, we're going to need to see him run the ball more than he did in college. I don't necessarily want to bank on that happening. Maybe it will happen as a rookie, but he's probably a guy that we can ignore. As again, like most rookie quarterbacks, you can generally ignore them from a fantasy standpoint. In Dynasty, though, I would have him ranked as my quarterback 2 behind Anthony Richardson. I think he's got a lot to like. He's got a cannon of an arm. He's a really good prospect. I think this offense is going to get better as they add weapons over the next couple of years. So CJ Stroud's a guy I really like going forward, but I think as a rookie we can pretty much ignore him. Next up, we've got Hendon Hooker, who was taken in the 3rd round by the Detroit Lions. I actually really like this landing spot for him. I personally think that Hendon Hooker is one of the more talented quarterbacks in this draft. I would have had him ranked as my 4th best quarterback prospect behind those 3 that I talked about previously. And honestly, Detroit's a really great landing spot for him. He's coming off of a torn ACL, so he was probably not going to be ready for the start of the season anyway, and that makes Detroit a great landing spot because he probably isn't going to start at all this season. Jared Goff's going to be the guy here. So it gives him a year to get healthy and sort of get caught up to speed with the NFL. But the Lions have a ton to offer in terms of what you'd want for a fantasy quarterback. They've got really great weapons outside in Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. They drafted Sam Laporta at tight end, who I really like going forward. And they've got 2 really good running backs in David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs. They've got a really great offensive line. So there's plenty of weapons around the quarterback to really make any quarterback who starts in this situation really, really useful from a fantasy standpoint. And he's got a really clear path to starting next season. If the Lions do struggle at all this season, it wouldn't be shocking to see them move off of Jared Goff. And I think Hendon Hooker could succeed in this system. He'd personally, for me, be my 4th highest ranked rookie quarterback in Dynasty. Obviously, he's not going to do anything for you this season. He's going to be a backup and coming off of an injury. So in season long, we can pretty much ignore him. But in Dynasty, I think Hendon Hooker's worth a shot and like a round 2, round 3 flyer and single quarterback, or maybe even a little bit higher in Superflex leagues. Next up, we've got Will Levis. I personally am not a huge fan of Will Levis. I don't think he's a very accurate quarterback. I think there's just a lot to not like about him. But regardless, he was the 4th quarterback taken in the draft. He was taken at pick 33 by the Tennessee Titans. Still, I don't think there's a whole lot to love here. He basically had a lost season this last season due to injury, and he just made a lot of bad decisions. I wasn't really in love with him as a prospect out of college, and he goes into a place that I don't think is really set up for a quarterback to succeed either. Tennessee is generally lacking offensive weapons. They've got Treylon Burks, who I do really like, and they've got Chig Okonkwo, who I think is a nice prospect tight end, somebody that could really evolve and be a good player. But outside of that, there aren't really any pass catchers that I'm comfortable with at all. Their running game obviously goes through Derrick Henry, but he's getting up there in age. The offensive line's been something that's not been great going the last couple of years, and something that honestly, without that, this whole team sort of falls apart. And he's obviously going to start the season as a backup. Ryan Tannehill's still there. They aren't going to be able to trade Tannehill or really shed that salary, so they're going to give Tannehill every opportunity to be the start of this season. I think that the only scenario where Will Levis gets into any games this season is if Ryan Tannehill struggles or the Titans struggle and they just want to see what they have. But really, in that scenario, if the Titans struggle enough that Will Levis needs to get into the starting lineup, then they're probably going to lose a lot of games this season, and that would mean they're going to have a high pick next year, and that probably means he gets replaced. So honestly, I think that we can pretty much write off Will Levis altogether. I think that if you want to take a late round flyer on him in Superflex, or in maybe a really late round flyer on him in a normal Dynasty League, you can. Maybe you're a fan, but I'm not. He's just in a bad spot. Not a really great talent either, so I'd pretty much out Will Levis at all costs. And finally, here we've got Stetson Bennett. He's the quarterback coming out of Georgia. He's coming off of 2 national championship seasons. He did finish as a Heisman candidate this last season, but despite all that, I think that myself and general scouts agree that he's just a generally mediocre prospect at the quarterback position. A lot of people have compared him to like a Case Keenum. Maybe he's got a Kirk Cousins ceiling in him, but he did go in the 4th round to the Los Angeles Rams, which is a decent landing spot for him. He was never going to be drafted to be a starter, so going to a spot where the quarterback has injury history and has sort of flirted with retirement does give him a shot at getting a starting opportunity. I personally think that, though, despite that, Los Angeles is a pretty unideal spot all around. They've got Cooper Kupp and pretty much nobody else to catch passes. Matthew Stafford is getting up there in age as well, but I think that when Stafford leaves, you're going to see Sean McVay and Cooper Kupp leave as well. So you're going to basically see whoever comes in after that really inheriting just a really ugly situation. And I would just be really shocked to see Stetson Bennett really perform at the pro level, especially with limited weapons. He's surprised people before. Maybe he can really come up and do well, but he's not a very good athlete, so he's not going to offer much on the ground. He's going to need a lot of really great weapons around him to ever put up really viable fantasy numbers. I think from a fantasy standpoint, he can also be ignored. Again, he's proven people wrong. He's a winner at least at the college level, so you can take a late round flyer on him and see if maybe he can hold on to a job, but I wouldn't bet on it. So that'll do it for the quarterback landing spots from this year's draft. If there's any quarterbacks that I didn't touch on that you think I should have, please do feel free to let me know in the comments. I'm happy to give you my opinion on any of them. I just thought that these were the only 6 that were really worth talking about from a fantasy perspective. Up next, I'll be talking about the running back position. I think there's going to be a lot to talk about there. That's really we really get into the meat and potatoes of the NFL draft and how it affects the fantasy season coming forward and in the future. If this is your first time on the channel, please do take a minute to like the video if you got anything out of it. Please subscribe to the channel if you'd like more content. You can click the notification bell so you get a notification when I put more videos out. Probably be putting out about 1 or 2 videos per week up until we get into July, and then maybe I'll ramp up the content to 2 or 3. And then once we get into the season, we do 3 videos every single week. So super excited about this season. The NFL season is going to be here before we know it, and I can't wait. So yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you next time.